This research presentation is a study of first-generation college student persistence at a mid-sized private institution in the Northeast. This presentation will start with an introduction of background and context, which will flow into the problem investigated. It will then go over the participants and collaborators involved throughout the study and the initiative that was launched in the second cycle of research. It will then cover the evaluation process and key findings, which will then be discussed in context. Lastly, it will go over the research dissemination plan and then conclude with any questions you may have. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, there are 26 million students attending 6,000 colleges across the United States. Fully one-third of them are first-generation college students, meaning they are the first in their family to go to college. Usually, in front of crowds, I would ask by show of hands how many were the first in their family to go to college. The answer to that question was always interesting to me, because time and time again, there was always somebody I didn't expect, which emphasizes the point that this population is difficult to identify. Students themselves are not even aware of their status unless they are specifically asked. Yet researchers report that first-generation college students were more likely to encounter academic and social challenges, to be disengaged, to struggle with college culture and feelings of isolation, and they were less likely to take advantage of college resources or to communicate their struggles to others. As a consequence, they were more likely to receive lower grades and drop out altogether. Some researchers indicate at a rate of 4 to 5 times more than their counterparts. This greater tendency is concerning, considering that the average graduation rate for all students is 59.5%. Much of what has been written about first-generation students focus on community colleges and schools in the South. This was understandable, as historically these institutions and regions had higher concentration of students who were the first in their families to attend college. However, first-generation students are not limited to these schools and areas, attending many different institutions from all over the country. Examining a private institution in the Northeast could yield insights on whether the first-generation experience is universal or distinct to the institution or region. This study is an exploration of these students at one such institution. The genesis of this project came from the convergence of 3 different issues. The first was a concern over graduation rates. This was a particular concern at the host institution. At the time of the study, it was 53%, which was 6.5% below the national average, and 19.4% below the average of similar schools. To put that into human terms, the host site had an undergraduate enrollment of 3,700. 1 percentage point is 37 people. That is a large classroom, and 19.4% is 19 large classrooms. Now, how many of these were first-generation students? The answer for the host site was unknown, which leads to the second issue, in that this population was essentially invisible. First-generation students were not tracked on university systems, nor were there any analyses performed to understand this population. All that existed were anecdotal reports from concerned staff and faculty that reported that first-generation students felt disconnected, had difficulty with institutional services, and were leaving the university without returning. It was only much later that it was determined that first-generation students accounted for 23.8% of the undergraduate population. The last issue followed from the previous. A natural consequence of not knowing about or not tracking specific populations is that all groups were treated the same. Unfortunately, a blanket approach to student services can render inequities among groups invisible. Researchers contend that a blanket approach to student services could specifically disadvantage the first-generation student population. The supports needed and obstacles faced were not always balanced out. This leads to the purpose of this action research study, which was to examine and improve first-generation college student persistence at a mid-sized private institution in the Northeast. For this study, a first-generation college student is defined as one whose parents did not attend college, while persistence is defined as the desire and action of a student to stay within the system of higher education from the beginning year through degree completion. The primary research question under investigation was whether establishing a series of targeted interventions could increase a sense of belonging and persistence for first-generation college students at a mid-sized private institution in the Northeast. Secondary questions that helped guide the first focused on the general experiences and challenges of first-generation college students. This study used a qualitative action research approach. Qualitative was desirable because of the need to have a deep understanding of the experience of the participants. Action research was desirable because it is designed to be collaborative and focused on application. Furthermore, iterative cycles of research allowed for multiple opportunities to refine and apply insights through different sets of participants, collaborators, and stakeholders. Cycle 0, or baseline participants, were staff and faculty members at the host site who were also first-generation college students. 4 colleagues individually participated in a 45-minute in-person, semi-structured interview. This cycle aimed to understand the first-generation college student experience at the research site through stakeholders that had regular contact. Cycle 1 participants were first-generation students at the host site who were on track to graduate. These were first-generation students who earned 90 credits or more and who maintained a 2.7 or higher grade point average. The selection criteria was informed by Cycle 0 participants and refined by the collaborators listed here, who suggested that these students were likely to persist to graduation. 11 students participated in a 65-minute semi-structured interview conducted in person. The goal of this cycle was to identify experiences, characteristics, and strategies employed by first-generation college students that could help create targeted interventions that could improve persistence. Collaborators shown here were from front-facing Student Services Office who, in addition to refining the selection criteria, helped in the recruitment of participants. And Cycle 2 participants were first-generation students who took part in any of the resulting first-generation initiatives activities by attending or serving on panels for events, using the resource website, or responding to the communications campaign. These will be discussed in detail later. Collaborators and stakeholders were university staff and student services offices that formed a 9-person task force that helped create, support, implement, and assess the initiative. The intervention plan for Cycle 2 was based on findings from Cycle 1. The 11 Cycle 1 interviews resulted in 202 pages of transcripts, which were analyzed in Atlas TI. Findings were refined and condensed over several passes through the use of a codebook, until there were 27 themes under 3 primary areas of struggles, supports, and success strategies. Of these 27, 6 rose to the top in terms of intensity and frequency. These are in red here, and are also listed in the following slide. These 6 struggles, supports, and success strategies were specific to the host site and was supported by the literature. Addressing these 6 findings would be the basis for the intervention, as it attempted to increase supports, remove obstacles, and leverage student strengths in order to maximize a sense of belonging and thus persistence. The First Generation Initiative consisted of 3 parts: an event series, a resource website, and a communications campaign. The goal of each of these component activities, separately and in concert, was to increase a sense of belonging and thereby persistence. Specifically, a 9-member interdepartmental task force was formed, and 24 collaborator meetings were held over the course of 10 months. Whenever an event or activity was discussed, which is everything on the y-axis, the intent was to see if it addressed any of the Cycle 1 target areas, everything on the x-axis. Looking at things through this lens helped guide actions and activities and steer away from generic solutions or the temptation to use a best practice without addressing local student concerns. The 3 main components of the initiative were then evaluated separately and in concert. Several data collection methods were used. Field notes, analytic memos, and member checks were used for all components. Attendance records were used to evaluate events and the effectiveness of the communications campaign. Emails to Cycle 1 participants went out to assess the resource website and also the communications campaign. Each component also had specific evaluation measures such as event transcripts, field observations, web and email analytics reports, and social media. All available evidence was collected and consolidated using qualitative coding software. Patterns and trends from any of the initiative activities was further analyzed and organized using mind mapping software. and the researcher looked for evidence indicating if any of the initiative activities led to an increased sense of belonging or persistence. Also recorded was feedback on challenges and opportunities to improve. The results of the initiative were favorable. Cycle 2 findings indicated an impact beyond sense of belonging alone. The 3 elements of the initiative contributed in different ways to the goal of increasing persistence. The first finding is that the event series strengthened a sense of belonging. The events of the initiative were well attended, except for one, which may have had more to do with timing as opposed to relevancy. There were a total of 129 attendees over 6 events. Each event had an average of 22 attendees. The events gave visibility to first-generation student interests while placing participants in regular contact with staff, faculty, and student panelists. A review of existing literature and results from prior research cycles suggested that successful first-generation interventions needed to be consistent, relevant, and accommodating. The event series proved to be a suitable vehicle as it addressed all 3. The second key finding of this research was that the resource website was able to foster positive engagement. Traffic to the website was consistent and on the rise since its creation. It had 461 unique visitors and averaged 100 visitors a month. Consistent with the literature, it did so by being a vehicle that was accessible, empowering, and inclusive. The third key finding was that the communications campaign supported increased involvement. Events were advertised over email and social media. The communications campaign yielded the desired attendance results and interaction. Consistent with the literature, the campaign increased involvement by being trustworthy, proactive, and inclusive. Although the 3 components of the initiative tackled first-generation issues in different ways, a common thread among all was a focus on enhancing relationships, from administration to parents to peers, all of which, according to the literature, supported student persistence. In terms of impact at the local site, a robust first-generation program now exists offering sustained support, with focused events and activities, targeted communications, and a centralized website offering resources on an ongoing basis. First-generation programming is now an ongoing and permanent part of campus operations. The task force operates autonomously and has taken a life of its own. It has grown to include student and faculty stakeholders, and it is expanding to cover more of the student life cycle. And lastly, first-generation students are now an officially recognized population at the institution. Outcomes are now being tracked and recorded, and the unseen is now seen. In terms of the impact on the profession and practice, this research has shown that targeted interventions can indeed impact sense of belonging, positive engagement, and increase involvement at a private institution in the Northeast. Exploring how this can be replicated at similar institutions warrants further attention. There are 1.9 million students attending 490 private institutions in the Northeast. If 24% of these students are first generation, this equates to 460,000 students at 490 schools. Furthermore, this research has shown that robust programming can occur in even resource-constrained environments. Despite adverse conditions and the challenges of a global pandemic, this intervention was still able to be implemented. Money was not the key factor. The key factor was collaborative will. The dissemination of this research will include the following. The first is a recorded presentation for institutional stakeholders. Research findings have already been shared with the host site. However, a tailored version of this presentation can be helpful as a summary. The second is a submission to a practitioner journal. The Journal of First Generation Student Success, shown here, has launched its inaugural issue in April of this year. An article for a future issue is planned. The third is a presentation at a professional conference. The one indicated here occurs annually. However, there are also smaller sessions held throughout the year. The last is a contribution to a forthcoming action research text. So, what does the future hold? The first involves future research. In action research, iterative research cycles are used to gain a deep and layered understanding of a problem of practice. The program can continue to be refined at the host institution in the following ways. The first is to continue monitoring sense of belonging and persistence to degree for this group over time to measure longitudinal impact. The second is to expand the definition of first-generation college students. This study used a definition used by federal TRIO grant programs. It does not have to be the one the institution adheres to. The institution should use a definition that meets the needs of its students. The literature offered several variations on this definition that work on both a conceptual and operational level. For instance, several stakeholders commented that international students were interested in first-generation programming. Outreach to an external stakeholder revealed that their own institution included international and immigrant students regardless of parental background. The third is to examine the intersectionality of first-generation students with other groups. Now that tracking for this group is possible, it behooves the institution to examine the intersectionality of this population with other groups to explore potential equity gaps. Since the institution already captures information on ethnicity, gender, and income, these areas would be an ideal place to start. The fourth is to extend services to cover more of the student life cycle. One benefit of an interdepartmental task force is that each office can contribute as they are capable. Thus, program modules can be added or removed without loss of program cohesiveness. Programs could thus be extended to the pre-college or postgraduate stages. They could also extend to transfer and graduate students as they were also not included in the original cohort. Additionally, this research can be adopted at other institutions. As mentioned earlier, there are 1.9 million students attending 490 private institutions in the Northeast. If 24% of these students are first generation, this equates to 460,000 students, who, if left ignored, have a significant chance of dropping out. 1 percentage point represents 4,600 students whose dream was to go to college that would be a dream unfulfilled. It is recommended that the institution apply to become a first-gen forward institution so that its program can gain nationwide recognition. This program is a National Association of Student Personnel Administrators initiative, NASPA, that recognizes and provides resources to institutions committed to first-generation student success. Lastly, this study sought to address a potential gap in the literature regarding first-generation students at private schools in the Northeast. If the findings are applicable beyond private schools or the Northeast region, the potential impact for students across the country could be substantial. The next thing involves professional advocacy. These interventions were done during a pandemic when resources were stretched thin. The researcher's chosen profession in the analytics, planning, assessment, and institutional research field often affords the practitioner a privileged perspective. Those in it see a broad spectrum of institutional data. However, the practitioner can sometimes be hesitant to involve themselves in the research process. Yet this approach is the very thing that action research encourages. Instead of being passive purveyors of knowledge, action research insists on leadership and change agency. These organizations listed are ones in which the researcher is active. As a practitioner and advocate for the field, the researcher hopes to elevate the profession and make an impact on a broader scale. The last thing involves continued change agency. There are 3 aspects to change agency. You have to be able to see the problem, you have to be able to help others see the problem, and you have to do something about the problem. This research shone a flashlight on this particular problem. The process of becoming a scholar gave the researcher the confidence and the tools to address it. However, there is much more work to be done to make this world a better place, and I look forward to meeting those challenges head on. I thank you all again for taking the time to explore this topic with me. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.